Hi and welcome back to the channel. I like Blaxploitation as a genre. Yes, it has its problems from a social and political viewpoint, and I respect the people of colour who have outlined those problems. But when I was a teenager, Blaxploitation movies were among the films that were accessible to me. They were immensely popular in the suburbs of Australia. To see an A picture, you had to go into the city. The burbs, in the hardtop cinemas and the drive-ins were where you went to see exploitation films. That changed a little bit in the 1970s when old city cinemas like the Capitol, the Town and the State were showing unusual things like The Wicker Man and Raw Meat, the Ginger Trilogy, and The Case of the Smiling Stiffs. And the big Blaxploitation movie at the time, here at least, was Shaft. One of the first singles I bought was the theme from Shaft with Cafe Reggio on the flip side. Long before I saw the movie, I knew Isaac Hayes' Oscar-winning soundtrack. So let's look at the Shaft Trilogy and see what it does right and what it does wrong. For the sake of clarity, I'm not looking at John Singleton's 2000 reboot or the 2019 Tim Story movie, just the original three movies from the 1970s. Generalized spoilers are ahead. According to some sources, the original protagonist in the novel by Ernest Tidyman was white, but the director, Gordon Parks, changed it to a black private eye and everything snapped into focus. The novel I've got has Shaft as a black man, so I don't know whether it was rewritten after the movie was made. It's a little vague on those kind of facts. The movie started by giving us a lesson in how to establish the protagonist while the titles are running. The camera pans across cinema marquees in Times Square. You got Burt Lancaster's The Scalp Hunters, Rough Night in Jericho, Little Force and Big Halsey, He and She, The Animal, School for Sex, Wild Females, and then after we get that documentary footage of what the marquees were like in Times Square at the time, that iconic instrumental background played by the Barcades in the movement starts just as Richard Roundtree emerges from the subway on the way to his office. He looks in every direction and walks through the slow traffic. He's aware of what's around him. He's got that situational awareness happening. A street peddler tries to sell him a dodgy watch, but he flashes a fake police badge, and he walks fast. And Isaac Hayes' lyrics cut in at that stage, telling us that he's a private dick, he's a ladies' man, and he has integrity, though that's all a loose translation of the actual lyrics. The blind newspaper seller outside his building tells him that two guys are looking for him, so he approaches his office building warily. Even before Leroy takes a header out of Shaft's office window, we have his character, his location, his motivation, and the fact that he's part of his community well established. That's a masterclass in how to get things right from the word go. Gordon Parks Jr., a world-class photojournalist, a musician, a writer and director, who in 1969 made a semi-autobiographical movie called The Learning Tree, which I highly recommend. It is a fine piece of cinema. Parks' documentarian's eye for people, framing and location is one of the secret ingredients that makes Shaft such a hit. As Shaft gets into a case involving the kidnapped daughter of Harlem crime lord Bumpy Jonas, played brilliantly by Moses Gunn, you should check out the scene where Bumpy is talking to Shaft about his daughter. That's acting at a higher level than you usually get in an exploitation movie. By the way, Bumpy Jonas is a reference to Bumpy Johnson, the real-life Harlem gangster who died 3 years before they made this movie. Bumpy's psychic Willie is played by Drew Bundini Brown, who was the cornerman for Muhammad Ali during his boxing career. He also gave Muhammad Ali that line, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee." The second secret ingredient is Richard Roundtree, who is a former fashion model who went on to be part of the NEC Theatre Group in the late 1960s. And he is charismatic as hell as Shaft. He goes from friendly and joking to angry and violent in a consistent way. In the action scenes he moves well, and for someone in his first film role, he really carries the movie well. My favourite scene in Shaft is probably the no-name bar scene in Greenwich Village, where two mafia goons are watching Shaft's apartment. His bartender friend Rolly, played by Rex Robbins, is one of the first Hollywood studio portrayals of a gay man who wasn't seen as either tragic or monstrous.
Friend Valerie says she's hot for my body. I told her I was gay, and you know what she said? She'd straighten me out.
And the interesting thing is it plays out exactly the same way in the novel as it does on screen. But it's up in Harlem where Gordon Parks' direction shines. The locations around the Apollo Theatre are brilliantly shot, and the back streets get as much love as the main thoroughfares. Christopher St. John is good as Ben Buford, the revolutionary who helped Shaft with the case. And Charles Cioffi, straight after his role as the main villain in Clute, is great as Lieutenant Androzzi, the one cop in New York who treats Shaft with respect. And that brings us to the next secret ingredient, the score. Isaac Hayes' music for Shaft is the second best Blaxploitation score, right behind Curtis Mayfield's Superfly. The whole album works well when played through, though I have a fondness for Cafe Reggio, which is the flip side of that single and the theme from Shaft. I really like the kind of smooth, easygoing tone of it. The action scenes are really tough and crisp, and Shaft, oddly enough, was one of the only 3 MGM movies that made a profit in 1971 and saved MGM Studios at the time. So, of course, there was always going to be a sequel. Just to remember what the secret ingredients are: the location, the director, the star, and the soundtrack. That moves us on to Shaft's Big Score 1972. Shaft's Big Score keeps 3 of the 4 secret ingredients of the original: the star, the location, and the director. Gordon Parks had a falling out with Isaac Hayes, so Hayes didn't come back to do the score of the second movie, and so, being a musician himself, Parks scored the movie. The plot's pretty simple, really. One of Shaft's friends, Aspie, runs an insurance agency and funeral parlour, and the business is blown up. Shaft investigates and finds out that his friend and his friend's business partner Kelly ran a numbers racket out of the business, and the profits from that are missing. The partner Kelly also happens to owe $250,000 to a mobster called Gus Mascola. Mascola, played by Joseph Mascolo, has one of the most glaringly obvious hair pieces in 1970s cinema. But leaving that aside, his Mascola is a refined, clarinet-playing dandy who runs a funky nightclub with gambling in the back. Instead of Lieutenant Androzzi, this time we get Julius Harris as Captain Bolin, a corrupt cop who is trying to keep the lid on the gang war that's brewing between Mascola and Bumpy Jonas. Julius Harris isn't as good as Charles Cioffi was. He really doesn't give us much more than a kind of glaring, angry man portrayal of the character. There's a nice fight scene where Shaft is getting beaten up by Mascola's hoods, which cross-cuts with the dancers in his nightclub in a really odd but kind of fascinating way. I think it's a nice piece of editing. And in this movie, Shaft has gone up market a bit. Instead of taking the subway, he drives a red Mustang, and his Christopher Street apartment has had an upgrade. There are more beautiful women in this one and more nudity too. However, it's the last half an hour where this movie really shines. The action is ramped up to 11, and it includes a 20-minute climax that goes from a car chase to a car and helicopter chase, to a helicopter and boat chase, to Shaft being stalked by a helicopter, and Mascola's henchman Pascal, played by future Rockford Files co-star Joe Santos. For a movie of the 1970s, the stunt work in the climax is next level good, especially in the old naval dockyards where the helicopter stalks Shaft through the slipways and gantries as he fights back with a groovy looking combat shotgun. The action is all very well defined, there's no doubt about what's happening at any particular moment, and even if it might have benefited from a little bit of a tighter edit, it's still quite a good 1970s action sequence. Shaft's Big Score isn't as good as the first one, except for those action sequences, but even so, it kept the character true to the original, even as the studio's hands started turning the wheel. The aspect ratio changed from 1.85 to 1 to 2.35 to 1, giving us a widescreen Panavision view, which the third movie also has. But the movement away from the streets and into the high-rise gangster apartments weakens that grittiness that we love in Blaxploitation. Blaxploitation movies are always aspirational, but focusing on the rich people a little too much will always sour the milk. Shaft in Africa shows MGM really turning the wheel. The studio wanted a franchise that could be a black James Bond.
Now, wait a minute. Now, I'm not James Bond, simply Sam Spade.
Which was kind of silly because James Bond at the time was Roger Moore, the weakest of the James Bonds. The script was written by Sterling Silliphant and directed by John Gilliman, both of whom were white. Shaft is hired by an African emir to go undercover to break up a modern-day slave trade from Africa to Europe. He's trained to pass as an African worker, partly by a character called Ossiat, played by perennial angry police chief Frank McRae, and partly by the Emir's beautiful daughter Alemi, played by Vonetta McGee. Alemi is quite open about the cultural practices of her people.
I entered Shayla, my second age grade, this February, after my clitoridectomy. My clitoridectomy. Female circumcision.
Shaft flies from New York to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia via Orly in France, where there's an attempt on his life, and travels to the area where the slave recruiters are working. He also gets his photo taken with a lion. I like the idea of John Shaft outside his comfort zone, but this one leans into the James Bond comparison a little bit heavily. And yeah, they really do kind of borrow tropes from the 007 series to the detriment of what they actually have. We get a Eurotrash villain Amafi, played by English actor Frank Finlay, who has a memorable scene in the start of the movie in a Rolls Royce with a woman called Jassar, his consort, played by Nida Arnerich.
Frightened my dad.
John Shaft follows the slave route from Africa to Paris, and the film documents the plight of illegal workers in France in the 1970s, which shows how little things have changed in the Western world in some ways. But these scenes are done in a kind of passionless way. The director John Gilman went on to direct The Towering Inferno in the 1976 King Kong, but the action sequences here, when compared to the first two Shaft movies, are a bit flat, and the climax is a big letdown. The locations also needed someone with a better eye for framing shots and shooting landscapes. If you're going to go to Africa to shoot a movie, you should really make the landscapes pop. So what went wrong? Maybe it was the studio's grubby fingers turning gold into lead. Maybe it was the director's lack of deep cultural understanding of the intellectual property. There are a few good things in Shaft in Africa, to be fair to it. The theme song Are You Man Enough by the Four Tops is really great. Johnny Pace's soundtrack is serviceable. And Vonetta McGee has a warmth, a grace and a charm that lifts every scene she's in. It's also good to see Anglo-Indian actor Marn Maitland getting himself a nuanced role as well. After Shaft in Africa bombed at the box office, there was a brief 7-episode TV series starring Richard Roundtree, which was quickly cancelled. The Blu-ray of the original film has an episode of that series included, and it's PPO. 1970s American television was so weighted down with the chains of censorship that the show was Shaft in name only. An outlier was completely co-opted by the mainstream with the making of this series. It took 26 years for Shaft to return with the John Singleton reboot, then 19 more years for Netflix to do their own iteration, which was lifted by the charm and charisma of Richard Roundtree once again. But the original movie shows the road not taken by Hollywood. While the brief decade of Blaxploitation from Cotton Comes to Harlem to Rudy Ray Moore's Disco Godfather had many fine films in it, only one was made by a major Hollywood studio, and that was Shaft. So thank you very much for watching. If you want me to do more Blaxploitation movies, just let me know, and I'm more than happy to oblige. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing and hitting the like and notification bell. I do 2 videos a week, so there's plenty of content on this way. And as always, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch a bit of Blaxploitation cinema. And I'll catch you next time.